The fog rolled in thick over San Francisco, curling through the streets like a living entity. Emily sat in her tiny apartment, scrolling through Tinder, hoping for a distraction from her mundane routine. Her eyes landed on a profile that made her pause. His name was Ryan, and his piercing blue eyes and rugged charm drew her in. She swiped right, and within minutes, they matched. They started chatting, and there was an instant connection. Ryan was witty, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in her. After a few days of messaging, they decided to meet in person. Their first date was at a quaint coffee shop in North Beach. Ryan was even more attractive in person, and his presence was magnetic. They talked for hours, losing track of time as the sun dipped below the horizon. By the end of the night, Emily felt like she had known him forever. Over the next few weeks, their relationship deepened. They explored the city together, shared their dreams, and found comfort in each other's company. Everything seemed perfect, until one evening Emily received a strange message. She was at home, curled up with a book, when her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. The message read, "You and Ryan must go to 1323 Holloway Road tonight. Complete the task or face the consequences." Emily's heart raced as she read the message. She immediately called Ryan, who seemed equally disturbed. "This has to be some kind of joke," he said, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. "Should we go?" Emily asked, feeling a mix of curiosity and fear. Ryan paused for a moment. "Let's do it. If it's a prank, we'll find out soon enough. If not, we need to know what's going on." They drove to the address, the streets growing darker and more deserted as they approached their destination. The house at 1323 Holloway Road was a crumbling Victorian-era mansion, abandoned and sinister. It loomed over them, its windows like empty eyes. Emily shivered as they stepped out of the car. The air was thick with tension, and an eerie silence enveloped them. They approached the front door, which creaked open on its own. Inside, the house was even more foreboding. The air was stale, and the floorboards groaned under their feet. "Let's just get this over with," Ryan said, his voice echoing in the empty hallway. They found a note on a dusty table in the foyer. It instructed them to find and retrieve a small box hidden somewhere in the house. As they ventured deeper into the mansion, the atmosphere grew heavier, and Emily's sense of unease intensified. They split up to cover more ground. Emily found herself in a room filled with old photographs and furniture draped in white sheets. She felt a chill run down her spine as she scanned the room. Suddenly she heard a whisper, so faint, it was almost imperceptible. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Emily." Her blood ran cold. She turned around, but the room was empty. She called out for Ryan, but there was no response. Panic began to set in as she hurriedly searched the room, trying to find the box and get out as quickly as possible. Finally, in an old wardrobe, she found a small, ornate box. She grabbed it and rushed out of the room, calling for Ryan. She found him in a hallway, staring at a wall with a strange expression on his face. "Ryan, I found it. Let's go," she said, tugging at his arm. He turned to her, his face pale and eyes vacant. "We're not alone here, Emily," he whispered. They made their way to the living room where they placed the box on a dusty table. As they opened it, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing their flashlight. In the darkness, they heard footsteps approaching. Emily fumbled to turn the flashlight back on, and when she did, she saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. The woman stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt, hollow-eyed face. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Now you're trapped, just like the others." Emily and Ryan exchanged terrified glances. "What do you mean?" Ryan asked, his voice shaky. The woman pointed at Ryan, her finger trembling. "He doesn't belong here. He's already dead." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" The woman's eyes bore into Ryan's. "You were killed years ago, Ryan. This house is a trap for lost souls." Ryan looked confused, then horrified. "That's impossible. I'm alive. I'm right here." Emily felt the room spin around her. "This can't be true," she whispered. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The house, the messages, the whispers. It all pointed to a horrifying truth. The woman's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Emily felt a surge of disbelief mixed with a growing sense of dread. Ryan's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. "We need to leave," Emily said, grabbing Ryan's hand. "Now." As they turned to leave, the woman's voice stopped them. "You can't escape this place. Not until you complete the task." "What task?" Ryan demanded, his voice trembling. The woman's hollow eyes fixed on him. "You need to find the truth about your death. Only then can you be free." Ryan shook his head. "This is insane. I'm not dead." But Emily saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Ryan, we need to do what she says. We need to find out what happened." They climbed the creaking staircase to the second floor, where the air grew colder with each step. The house seemed to close in around them, its shadows lengthening and shifting. Emily felt a presence behind her, but every time she turned, there was nothing there. They entered a bedroom that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Ryan picked up an old photograph from the dresser. It showed a young man who looked just like him, standing with a woman who bore a striking resemblance to the ghostly figure they had encountered downstairs. "This is me," he whispered. "But how can that be?" Emily looked at the photograph, her mind racing. "Maybe you lived here once. Maybe you died here." Ryan's hand shook as he put the photograph down. "I don't remember any of this." They continued to search the room, finding old letters and journals that hinted at a tragic past. The woman in the photograph was named Elizabeth, and she had lived in the house with her husband Richard, the man who looked like Ryan. One journal entry caught Emily's eye. It was dated July 5th, 1995, and it spoke of strange occurrences in the house, of voices and shadows that haunted Elizabeth after Richard's mysterious death. As they read, the room grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. Emily felt a chill run down her spine as she turned to Ryan. "We need to find out how you died." Ryan nodded, his expression grim. "Let's check the basement. Maybe there's something there." The basement door creaked open, revealing a dark, damp staircase that seemed to descend into the very bowels of the earth. Emily's flashlight flickered as they made their way down, the air growing colder and more oppressive. At the bottom of the stairs, they found an old wooden door. It was locked, but Ryan managed to break it open with a rusty crowbar they found nearby. Inside, the basement was a maze of old furniture, crates, and forgotten relics. In the far corner, they discovered a small, hidden room. It was filled with old newspaper clippings and police reports, all concerning the mysterious death of Richard Williams, Ryan's past self. Emily read the reports with growing horror. Richard had been found dead in the house, his body mutilated beyond recognition. The cause of death was never determined, and Elizabeth had gone mad with grief, claiming that Richard's spirit haunted the house. Ryan's face was ashen. "This can't be real. How can I be Richard?" Emily squeezed his hand. "Maybe you were reincarnated, or maybe your spirit never left this place. But we need to find out what really happened to you." They continued to search the basement, eventually finding a hidden compartment in the floor. Inside was a blood-stained diary that belonged to Elizabeth. Her final entries spoke of a dark presence in the house, something that had driven Richard to madness and ultimately his death. "We need to confront whatever this is," Ryan said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We need to end this." As they made their way back upstairs, the house seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. The walls pulsed, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Emily felt a growing sense of dread as they entered the living room once more. The ghostly figure of Elizabeth was waiting for them. "You found the truth," she said, her voice echoing. "But you must face the darkness that haunts this house." Emily and Ryan stood together, holding hands as the room grew darker. Shadows twisted and writhed around them, and a deep, guttural growl filled the air. "We're not afraid," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We're here to end this." The darkness surged forward, enveloping them in a whirlwind of shadows and whispers. Emily felt herself being pulled into a void, and she clung to Ryan, determined not to let go. As the darkness closed in, Emily saw a flash of light. She heard Elizabeth's voice, distant but clear. "Thank you for setting us free." Then everything went black. Emily awoke to find herself lying on the floor of the living room, the house eerily silent. Ryan was beside her, his face pale but peaceful. She sat up, feeling disoriented and weak. "Ryan, are you okay?" she whispered, shaking his shoulder. Ryan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "I think so." "What happened?" Emily looked around, trying to piece together the fragments of her memory. "We confronted the darkness. Elizabeth thanked us, and then everything went dark." Ryan sat up, rubbing his temples. "Do you think it's over?" Before Emily could respond, they heard a faint whisper. It was Elizabeth's voice, but it was calm and gentle this time. "Thank you for freeing us. You have broken the curse." Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. "I think we did it, Ryan. We broke the curse." As they stood up, the house seemed to come alive with light. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the air felt fresh and clean. They made their way to the front door, which swung open easily, revealing the first light of dawn. Outside, the world looked brighter, more vibrant. They stepped into the morning sun, feeling a sense of liberation and peace. Back at Emily's apartment, they sat together, processing the night's events. It felt surreal, like a nightmare they had finally woken from. Ryan looked at Emily, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me, for helping me find the truth." Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "We did it together, and now you're free." In the days that followed, Emily and Ryan tried to return to normal life. But the experience had changed them both. They felt a deeper connection, forged in the crucible of their terrifying ordeal. They visited the library to learn more about the history of the house, and discovered that it had a long and troubled past. Many who had lived there had experienced strange occurrences, and there were rumors of dark rituals and malevolent spirits. But now, thanks to Emily and Ryan, the house was finally at peace. Emily felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had not only freed Elizabeth and Richard, but had also helped countless other souls who had been trapped in the house's grip. A few weeks later, they decided to visit the house one last time. They wanted to see it in the light of day, to confirm that the darkness was truly gone. As they approached, they saw that the house had changed. It no longer looked menacing, but rather like a relic of the past, weathered but serene. They walked through the front door, which no longer creaked ominously. Inside, the house was bathed in sunlight, and the air was fresh and clean. They explored the rooms, finding no trace of the darkness that had once haunted them. In the living room, they found a small, ornate box, the same one they had opened that fateful night. Inside was a note from Elizabeth. "Thank you for setting us free. May you find peace and happiness." Emily and Ryan smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. They had faced their fears and emerged stronger for it, and now they could move forward, knowing that they had made a difference. As they left the house, Emily took one last look at it. Goodbye, Elizabeth. Rest in peace. Ryan wrapped his arm around her and they walked away, ready to embrace whatever the future held. Months passed, and life seemed to return to normal for Emily and Ryan. They had settled into a routine, finding comfort in their growing relationship. But the events of that night at the house on Holloway Road had left an indelible mark on both of them. One evening, Emily sat at her desk, writing in her journal. She found solace in documenting her thoughts and feelings, trying to make sense of the extraordinary experience they had shared. As she wrote, she felt a chill in the air, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Emily turned around, half expecting to see a ghostly figure, but the room was empty. She shook her head, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Ryan entered the room, noticing her discomfort. "Are you okay?" Emily forced a smile. "Just a bit jumpy, I guess." Ryan sat beside her, taking her hand. "It's understandable. We went through a lot." Emily nodded, grateful for his presence. "I keep thinking about Elizabeth and Richard. It's hard to believe it's all over." Ryan squeezed her hand. "We did what we had to do. They're at peace now, and so should we be." The next day, Emily received a package in the mail. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Curious, she opened it and found an old, leather-bound book inside. The title read, "The Haunting Truth, Unveiling the Secrets of Holloway Road." She flipped through the pages, realizing it was a detailed account of the house's history, including stories of those who had lived and died there. As she read, she felt a growing sense of dread. The book mentioned a curse that lingered even after the spirits were freed, a curse that would haunt anyone who had entered the house. Emily's heart raced as she read the final chapter. It spoke of a dark force that fed on fear and despair, a force that could never be truly vanquished. She felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She showed the book to Ryan, who looked equally disturbed. "Do you think this is real?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ryan's face was grim. "I don't know, but we can't ignore it." Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, they sought out an expert in paranormal activity. Dr. Evelyn Moore was a renowned investigator with years of experience dealing with haunted locations. She agreed to meet them and review the book. They sat in her cluttered office, surrounded by artifacts and relics from past investigations. Dr. Moore examined the book carefully, her expression growing more serious with each page. "This is troubling," she said finally. "The entity described here is not a typical ghost. It's something far more sinister." Emily felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. "What do we do?" Dr. Moore leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual. It's risky, but it might be the only way to rid yourselves of this curse." Emily and Ryan agreed, knowing they had no other choice. Dr. Moore provided them with a list of items they would need for the ritual and instructed them to return to the house on Holloway Road. As they gathered the necessary items, Emily couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. She knew they were about to face something far more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. They arrived at the house just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the lawn. The house loomed before them, its presence as menacing as ever. Dr. Moore met them at the door carrying a large bag filled with ritual supplies. "Stay close to me," she instructed, "and whatever happens, do not break the circle." They entered the house, which seemed to welcome them with an eerie silence. Dr. Moore led them to the living room, where she began setting up the ritual space. She drew a large circle on the floor with salt, and placed candles at each cardinal point. As she chanted in an ancient language, the air grew heavy and oppressive. Emily and Ryan held hands, their hearts pounding with fear. Suddenly, the candles flickered, and a cold wind swept through the room. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing as if they had a mind of their own. Dr. Moore's chanting grew louder, more urgent. Emily felt a presence in the room, something dark and malevolent. She glanced at Ryan, who looked equally terrified. The room grew colder, and the shadows closed in, forming a dark mass in the center of the circle. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the entity took shape, its form shifting and changing. Dr. Moore continued to chant, her voice unwavering. The entity seemed to recoil, but it was clear that it was not going to give up easily. Emily and Ryan stood within the circle, their hearts pounding as the dark entity swirled around them. Dr. Moore's chanting grew louder, filling the room with an almost palpable energy. The entity roared, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. Emily felt a wave of fear wash over her, but she held onto Ryan's hand, drawing strength from his presence. Dr. Moore reached into her bag and pulled out a vial of holy water. She sprinkled it around the circle, and the entity shrieked in pain, its form writhing and contorting. "You must leave this place," Dr. Moore commanded, her voice strong and authoritative. "You have no power here." The entity seemed to hesitate, its form flickering. Emily felt a surge of hope, but it was quickly dashed as the entity lunged toward them, slamming against the invisible barrier of the circle. Emily and Ryan stumbled back, but Dr. Moore held her ground. She continued to chant, her voice rising above the entity's roars. "You are not welcome here," she repeated. "Return to the darkness from whence you came." The entity howled, a sound that shook the very foundations of the house. Emily felt the ground tremble beneath her feet, and for a moment, she feared the house would collapse around them. But Dr. Moore remained steadfast. She drew a symbol in the air with the holy water, and the entity recoiled, its form dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows. The room grew brighter as the entity's presence faded. Emily felt a weight lift from her shoulders, and she dared to hope that they had finally won. Dr. Moore finished the ritual with a final chant, and the air grew still. The house seemed to sigh in relief, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. "It's done," Dr. Moore said, her voice weary but triumphant. "The entity is gone." Emily and Ryan embraced, relief flooding through them. They had faced their fears and emerged victorious. As they left the house, the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the city. They felt a sense of closure, knowing that they had finally laid the past to rest. In the days that followed, they continued to document their experiences, sharing their story with those who would listen. They became advocates for those who had experienced similar hauntings, using their knowledge to help others. Years later, Emily and Ryan returned to the house on Holloway Road. It had been renovated and restored, and it now stood as a testament to their courage and determination. They walked through the rooms, feeling a sense of peace. The house was no longer haunted, but it held a special place in their hearts. As they stood in the living room where they had faced their greatest fear, Emily turned to Ryan. "We did it," she said, smiling. Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with pride. "We did." Emily and Ryan's story became a local legend, inspiring countless others to face their own fears and confront the unknown. They continued to live in San Francisco, their bond stronger than ever. They started a podcast, The Haunting Truth, where they shared their experiences and interviewed others who had encountered the supernatural. Their following grew, and they became well-known figures in the paranormal community. On one particular episode, they decided to revisit the house on Holloway Road. They brought along Dr. Moore and a team of investigators determined to document any lingering energy or activity. As they set up their equipment, Emily felt a sense of anticipation. The house was now a part of their lives, and she was curious to see if any traces of the past remained. The team conducted a thorough investigation, using state-of-the-art technology to detect any anomalies. They recorded EVPs, took thermal images, and monitored electromagnetic fields. Despite their efforts, the house remained quiet. There were no signs of the dark entity that had once haunted its halls. "It's truly at peace," Dr. Moore said, her voice filled with satisfaction. "You did more than just free the spirits. You cleansed this place of its darkness." Emily and Ryan felt a sense of accomplishment. Their journey had been long and arduous, but it had been worth it. As they wrapped up their investigation, they recorded their final thoughts for the podcast. Emily spoke of the importance of facing one's fears and the power of perseverance. Ryan shared their story, emphasizing the lessons they had learned along the way. "We've come a long way," Emily said, her voice filled with emotion, "and we couldn't have done it without each other." Ryan smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "Together, we can overcome anything." Their podcast episode became one of the most popular in their series, resonating with listeners around the world. They received messages of support and gratitude, and their community grew even stronger. Emily and Ryan continued to explore the paranormal, traveling to haunted locations and sharing their findings. They wrote a book about their experiences, which became a bestseller and further cemented their status as leading figures in the field. They also started a foundation to help those affected by supernatural phenomena, offering support and resources to those in need. Their lives were busy but fulfilling. They had turned their terrifying experience into a source of strength and inspiration, helping others find their own paths to healing and understanding. One evening, as they sat on their balcony overlooking the city, Emily turned to Ryan. "Do you ever think about that night at the house?" Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I do. It changed us in so many ways, but it also brought us closer together." Emily smiled, taking his hand. "I wouldn't change a thing. We faced our fears and came out stronger for it." Ryan squeezed her hand, his eyes filled with love. "Here's to our next adventure." As the sun set over San Francisco, Emily and Ryan sat together, ready to face whatever the future held. They knew that no matter what came their way, they would always have each other.